Welcome, Eagles, to another episode of TradCatKnight Radio. I'm Eric Gajewski, founder and owner of TradCatKnight, the most viewed and followed traditional Catholic website in the world, ranked #1 by Alexa now as it relates to traditional Catholicism, and a top 25,000 website. Ladies and gentlemen, that puts us right next to websites such as EWTN and LifeSite News in terms of overall visibility. So I appreciate you all. In terms of sharing the information, in terms of spreading word of TradCatKnight. Our news broadcasts and radio shows are picked up by Veterans Today, which is even a larger website than this one. So we're able to get out the message of Fatima. We're able to get out traditional Catholicism to those who are not following what our Lord has laid down in the true religion. If I have not mentioned this already, please subscribe to TradCatKnight. Very important that you stay connected to all the latest information. And today's guest is a returning guest. Certainly the traditional Catholic world already knows Mr. Bernard Janzen. We had a great talk last time that just unbelievable feedback in terms of how everyone was appreciative of just Bernard and I sitting down and talking about Father Malachi Martin. And Bernard is essentially going to be representing Father Malachi Martin's position. He knew Father Martin very well, obviously conducted a lot of interviews with him, which you can find still on YouTube. Bernard is the owner of Triumph Communications, a publisher of Catholic books and recordings. He's a well-known journalist. As I've mentioned, interviewed a wide range of traditional Catholic authors, including Bishop Williamson and Malachi Martin. And his website is triumphcommunications.net. And I encourage you all to pick up his latest works. I believe it's an 8-book set called The Wisdom of the Ages. And this is in relation to Father Malachi Martin's work. To get us started here, Bernard, why don't you start us off with some of the basics? I don't even think we covered this in our initial talk. When you met Father Malachi Martin, maybe how long you knew him, and just lay down a foundation and give us some of the basics in terms of, when you met him, how long you knew him, because obviously you have some key insights which you'll bring up today.
Well, Father Martin was a celebrity, so it wasn't that easy to get a hold of him, but I was very persistent, and he did agree to do a set of interviews. And once they were successful, he said he had responses from all 50 states as a result of these interviews. He was quite willing to do more. So the pattern is that for the last decade of his life, we'd get together once a year in New York City, and we would do one set of interviews, 3 hours long, 3 interviews.
Wow, that's actually a lot longer than I thought. I didn't realize it was once a year, and you kind of broke them down like that. What's the first topic that we'd like to get into? I know in developing a schema for this talk, I believe it was a lecture that you delivered in Post Falls, Idaho, 2016, concerning Malachi Martin. The message indeed is apostasy in our times, and I've talked about this often when I go on radio shows, how the majority of individuals today, Bernard, who on the objective level consider themselves to be Catholic, are literally following this Vatican II new religion, otherwise called the Novus Ordo religion. Pope Paul VI called it the cult of man when referring to Vatican II. We had Benedict XVI come out and say, we were attempting to try to create a marriage between the revolution and the church, which we know is impossible. It's very, very carefully packaged with statements that are highly ambiguous. And, where does this all start from? Let's just kind of break down maybe modernism, if you will, and maybe some of Pope St. Pius X's writings. And I know Father Malachi Martin, obviously, was teaching about Pope St. Pius X. Maybe we could start there.
Well, modernism has been described as the synthesis of all heresies. In other words, modernism is an apostasy. But the kind of apostasy that modernism is not the kind of apostasy or heresy that we saw in the past, where people would repudiate a teaching of the church or repudiate all of the teachings of the church. They would continue to claim to be Catholic. In other words, modernism was really apostasy in Catholic language. Therefore, it was camouflaged. And Pope Pius X saw the danger. He suppressed apostasy of modernism with all his might. And he required all ordained priests to take an oath against modernism. I believe there was only 40 priests at the time which did not take this oath. So for a while, the modernist ideology went underground, but it came out again during Vatican II and actually triumphed for most of the official church.
Yeah, I kind of liken it to this, Bernard. If Catholicism represents Budweiser, I realize this is a very loose analogy, and the ultimate ends of these New World Order types is to create a one-world religion, a formal one-world religion, which in my opinion will happen here very soon. So in order for them to get it from the Budweiser stage to the water stage, if you will, to where it's completely diluted of anything Catholic, there was kind of like that intermediary ground, the Bud Light stage. And that's basically what I kind of relay Vatican II as, where people are confused. On the surface it seems Catholic. Does it taste the same? Sorta. But in reality, it's really not. I mean, there obviously is a distinction between Budweiser and Bud Light. So when I use Vatican II Catholicism, I always say it with a K because it's simply a rebranding. Would you agree?
It is a rebranding, but it actually is an empty vessel. And one thing you have to see about the post-Vatican II religion is that for most people, it is just like a mid-stage out. In other words, if you go to any of the churches where modernism has been implemented, what you will find is that the older generation will stick with it. But the younger generation may hang around a bit. They may get their marriages done there. They may get their children baptized. They may go to church at Christmas and Easter. But for the main part, they're on their way out. And then the generation after them is simply unchurched. So what you are seeing is a mass apostasy where people are leaving. But for the regular churchgoer is not all of a sudden, for the most part, just going to stop going to Mass.
Sure.
Therefore, the modernists sort of have the older generation, but what I see in the parishes around where I live, it's a handful of people keeping these Novus Ordo parishes open. This handful of people are usually elderly, and in another generation, they're going to be closing rural churches. I see this for the liberal Protestant denominations. They're ahead of the curve. They were into modernism long before the Catholic Church was. And their churches are now closing in rural areas where I live. And the Catholic churches usually aren't closing yet, but they're diminishing.
Now, since you knew Father Martin so well, I mean, what was his advice to confused Catholics? We had Archbishop Lefebvre, who wrote several works specifically for people who are confused in the church, where they're not able to grasp a lot of these principles coming from the Novus Ordo religion that's been branded Catholic. What did he advise your everyday layman to do? Was it simply just to, grab yourself a catechism of Pius X, just read all the pre-Vatican II encyclicals? I know on the surface level it's not quite that easy, but I mean, what was his advice?
Well, this is where you start. I'll also quote Bishop Williamson, who said, before you read any newspapers, you have to read some old papers. In other words, you have to read the old catechisms, the old books. And then that gives you a grounding to withstand kind of the modernist propaganda. Then, on top of that, you have to keep a strong prayer life. You have to pray your rosary every day. Malachi Martin strongly emphasized the fact that Catholics have to keep up their devotions. And that will give a person light and strength to be able to resist what is sometimes very attractive language. Like the language of the modernists sometimes is very appealing. We must all love each other. We must all get together. It all sounds nice, but it destroys the faith. When you look at the actual results, it destroys the faith. So it's a combination of staying close to our Lord through reading and through prayer.
Yeah, and that's wonderfully said. I mean, I agree with you. The way they say things, for the most part, it's so carefully packaged to where they're not openly denying the faith. And again, I think this is probably where you and I would disagree with Sedevacantist, who argue just along the lines of the V2 popes being formal or manifest heretics. When I always argue back that Rome has hidden under this whole notion of hermeneutics of continuity. Did Father Martin mention anything along those lines, how Rome was still saying, hey, no, what we're saying is Catholic, when in reality it's not?
Well, that was an initiative actually of Pope Benedict XVI, this continuity. I don't think that John Paul II was as concerned about continuity as much as Pope Benedict. Pope Benedict was still too much of a Catholic to simply say, well, now we're having a new departure. So he tried to reconcile Vatican II with the old teaching. I don't think he succeeded because, as you see, his papacy ended up in collapse. In the end, he resigned, I think, under pressure. And I believe that the last straw was his attempt to bring the Society of St. Pius X within the fold. And when that did not succeed, he could not carry out his agenda, because in order to reconcile tradition and modernism, you had to bring within the fold the largest body that was representing tradition.
Yeah, I agree with you. I take an awful lot of heat for just pointing out some of the obvious statements, heterodox statements that John Paul II had made, and I know Father Martin was pointing these things out too. Can you maybe give us a little bit more insight as to some of the things that Father Martin was pointing out about John Paul II? Maybe even some things that we might not know behind the scenes that he was saying. Because I know when I talk to a lot of people who are still following Vatican II, that's one of the first things they run to. Oh, he talked about St. John Paul II this way, and then they kind of just shut down and they don't want to listen to you.
I will use one example. Pope John Paul II, when he was pressured, would always say that he believed in the Church's doctrine, outside the Church there's no salvation. But what Malachi Martin also said about Pope Paul II, was that through his actions, he belied this doctrine because his policy of ecumenism was very active. There was this horrific meeting in Assisi, which has since been repeated. John Paul II would never miss an opportunity to get together with some religious leader of some other faith. He even met with the voodoo priests in Haiti. So he may have given lip service to the idea or the teaching of the Church that outside the Church there's no salvation. But through his actions, he, I believe, showed that he did not actually believe in this doctrine. And this is a characteristic of the current apostasy. The new apostate does not officially deny the old teaching. He just uses Catholic language to cloak the fact that he no longer believes it. So it's not clear-cut for the laity sometimes where a clergyman or a churchman will stand, because the new apostates, the new heretics, they're not like Martin Luther, who says, let's say the papacy stinks of oblation, that we believe in sola scriptura. The new apostate, the new heretic will say, we do believe in the old teaching, but today we have a new understanding of it.
Yeah, and that's just it. That's one of the things we talk about too here at TradCatKnight. You know, Father Hess talk about this quite often. There simply just seems to be a new understanding of tradition. It's now being labeled living tradition, and this ties in with modernism and evolutionism. They believe that the church should progress as the quote-unquote world progresses, and now we're seeing on the horizon, you know, a day where maybe there'll be women deacons. Did Father Martin prophesy about that? The day where we might actually see, you know, women priests, women deacons. I mean, it's just, we're heading into uncharted waters. As if things aren't bad already, folks. I've been warning you, it's only going to get far worse, even in the next year or two.
Malachi Martin foresaw this happening. He said already, in reality, there are women priests that have been secretly ordained and that are functioning.
Wow.
So this already existed at that time, and it continues to exist today. Now, women deacons are likely to happen because very often, as Malachi Martin pointed out, how changes are introduced in the church is that first, they will break the law, and then the law will be changed to account for this break. In other words, the law will be modified so that these people who broke the law at the beginning are no longer breaking the law. This is how communion in the hand was introduced. This is how altar girls are introduced. But Malachi Martin did say one thing, that if they officially did start ordaining women, that then Rome would cease to be Rome, and we are certainly then going to be in uncharted waters if that happens.
Yeah, no question about it. For the record, if you could get, now speaking along lines of ambiguity, you know, I've always argued for those who still say that we can still accept Vatican II, I clearly just revert back to Scripture, where our Lord said, let your yea be your yea, you know, your nay be your nay. And obviously this did not come from the Holy Ghost when we're dealing with ambiguity. That has brought forth novelty, and then novelty certainly is just another way of saying heresy. So from our perspective, there, you know, Vatican II is heretical, and as Father Hess mentioned, the Conciliar Church is in a material schism. What was Father Martin's formal positions on Vatican II and the new Mass? Because you see videos out there of him saying the new Mass was invalid, but I believe that was before Benedict XVI changed the words in the canon. Maybe you could break that down a little bit in terms of his formal positions, you know, on Vatican II, on the new Mass, and maybe explain also why he did not espouse the Sedevacantist thesis.
Well, some people whom Michael Davies called conservatives believe that Vatican II is entirely correct, but it was interpreted badly.
Right.
Malachi Martin did not hold that. He said that the problems are in the documents. Some of the documents state things that are actually false. That was his view of Vatican II. He also believed, with regards to the new Mass, that the form of it that was used in English-speaking countries until the reign of Benedict XVI was invalid, because when he used the words for all instead of for many, you actually changed the meaning of the whole canon of the Mass, and that invalidated it. Now, it'd be very interesting to see what he would say now, that a major objection of his about the new Mass was corrected by Benedict XVI.
And why? Lastly, why didn't he espouse? I mean, you and I both see this. I mean, State of Acontis will actually smear Father Martin left and right. Why didn't he ultimately espouse the State of Acontis thesis? Since you knew him pretty well.
Well, the Sedevacanist thesis states that this pope is no longer pope, but Malachi Martin believed that a pope can fall into error but still be a pope, sort of like a father who is a drunkard is still the father of the child who wishes that his father would stop drinking. And today's popes have drunk of the wine of modernism. But Malachi Martin did not believe that that made them not popes, but it did put them in error.
Yeah, I agree with you. That's where you and I, Father Martin, agree. Father Hess, my old spiritual director, Father Kramer. I mean, material heresy. There's a difference between material heresy and formal and manifest heresy. That's where I think the State of Acontis go off track. I mean, not to mention prophecy will prove our position. I know that's a secondary tool that we use to prove our position, but Our Lady of Fatima. That's why we don't see the State of Acontis talking about that too much. I mean, Father Martin was such an advocate, obviously, of our Rosary, of the Rosary, Our Lady, and Fatima. Maybe talk a little bit about that and its significance. It's we're seeing all these events happening. Bernard, I don't know if you saw yesterday on the news, more NATO troops on the border of Ukraine and Russia. Russia is really gearing up for an actual invasion. I did a blog on that today. I mean, things are really heating up in that area. So maybe you can talk about the message of Fatima here briefly. But then, didn't Father Martin make mention to pay attention to that Kiev, Ukraine area?
Well, he did. And he believed that salvation would come from the east. That wouldn't be what he chose, but that was what God chose. That is what Our Lady chose. And it was in the message of Fatima that, and you've probably on your show gone over this many times with guests such as Father Kramer, that the Pope in union with the bishops must consecrate Russia to her Immaculate Heart. And when that happens, then there will be a period of peace. Then there will be a restoration of the church. But it sounds like things have to get very low in the church before today's group of churchmen will do that, because for the most part, they don't want to hear of the message of Fatima. That conflicts with kind of their new ideology of the church being an institution which is there to build man's habitat on earth. That was the message of Pope Paul VI's closing speech at the end of Vatican II.
Yeah, so what do you think Father Martin would say, or what did he say in relation to, I mean, how do we get things turned around? Obviously, we know the intercession of our Blessed Virgin Mary. There are many quote-unquote traditionalists out there who think that, if we all kind of band together, so to speak, we can kind of infiltrate the conciliar church and kind of, take them over, so to speak, take the modernists over. That wouldn't be my position. How do the great chastisements fit into this equation? I mean, would this be Father Martin's position in terms of a source of a turning around in the church? Kind of like.
Well, I think he believed that the modernists and what he called the super force were so entrenched and so powerful that no banding together of traditional Catholics would be a match for this group. Things have gone so far that we need to have the intervention of Our Lady to turn things around. And so when various traditional Catholics hatch plans like this, you can be quite sure that Father Martin, and I would share that point of view, would not believe that it's realistic, it's dreaming, because there was also an event which Father Martin referred to in Windswept House in the early 1960s, where Lucifer was enthroned in the Vatican itself in a secret ceremony. which Paul VI knew about but could not stop. Now, if things have got that far, our little plans are not going to be able to have that impact. We may be able to do something to keep the faith alive in the catacombs, but if we think that we can take over the church with our handful of people, that is not realistic.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that again. We try to, as resistance, if you will, we have to draw some criticisms from time to time, and that's just something I can't understand in terms of the direction that the Society of St. Pius X is moving into. We've always said that, and even Archbishop Lefebvre said that. It's completely delusional and dreamy. So right there you have Father Martin and Archbishop Lefebvre affirming that. And so I agree with you, and I agree with Father Martin and Archbishop Lefebvre. But talk a little bit more about this underground church. I mean, what did Father Martin say about this? Go ahead. I'll follow up after.
Malachi Martin believed that the underground church was anything which was not official. Now, there were many components to the underground church. One of the components of the underground church was the Society of St. Pius X. In the United States, you've had the good fortune of having many independent priests, and you mentioned some of them on your show. We had one in Canada, Father Normandin. You've had quite a few of them in the United States. You also have some priests who are part of the official church, but who conduct clandestine masses. And there's a precedent for this, because in the Protestant Reformation in England, there were both priests of the official church, and there were, let's say, what you call rider priests that were going from house to house and saying mass in secret rooms and so forth. So the underground church does not have a single structure. It is a network more than anything else.
Yeah, and I think we both can agree as things continue to get worse and worse, it will become, I think, all the more, how should I put this, prevalent to those who are of goodwill, who truly want to be Catholic, as far as we know Catholics should be, that there is an underground church. And this is where you get debate amongst traditionalists. I know Father Kramer and I were in a heated debate with John Salza over this matter. But yeah, I mean, this is what the early church fathers warned of, that we are essentially returning to the catacombs. It will seem like the church will be invisible. It won't be invisible, therefore it's not breaking that actual doctrine of the visibility of the church, but it will seem like that. And so I simply offer, as a follow-up, what happens when you change the understanding and notion of tradition? Well, you virtually can get away with anything, folks. And today's guest, I am talking with Mr. Bernard Janzen of Triumph Communications. Please get to his website. Lots of great information there. Lots of great recordings from traditional Catholic individuals, priests. And so make sure you get out there and support his work, please. What do you think Father Martin would say today? If he were with us today, what would he make of Francis? We recently just had, the celebration of the Reformation and Luther. Then we also had, I don't know if you saw this one, I'm sure you did, where Francis came out and said, communists make the best Christians. So maybe we're moving out of that ambiguity stage, and it's just going to be full-blown. And by the way, Father Kramer makes his case that Francis is a manifest heretic. That's a topic for a whole other show. But what do you think Father Martin would say?
Well, when Malachi Martin was alive, he did say it was very possible that a modernist pope would be elected. And he also said that the consequences of that would be very dire. Well, I think now we are in that situation. Now, we have to back up a bit here.
Sure.
Because very often the language of the modernist is very confusing for the laity, because the modernist will never actually, or not usually, deny a specific doctrine of the church. So how do you separate the sheep from the goats? How does a layperson know if a churchman is someone they can follow or not? You can't go by what they say, according to Malachi Martin. They will always tell you kind of what you want to hear. You make that judgment based not on what they say, but on what they do. And let's start with an example that Malachi Martin used.
Sure.
He said that sometimes after the Mass, a priest will take the leftover precious blood of Jesus and dump it down the sink. Now he said this, that if a priest does that, don't tell me that he actually believes in that the Eucharist is truly the body and blood of Jesus. Because through his actions, he is showing that he doesn't believe that. Now let me use an example today. Let's fast forward a generation from Malachi Martin's time. During the last election in the United States, I watched the third debate where Mrs. Clinton very clearly said that she believed in a woman's right to procure an abortion, and she even defended late-term abortions. Now, was there an outcry from the bishops in the United States? What was your observation on that?
Yeah, you don't hear much out of the bishops these days.
That's right. So the fact is, it was even worse than that. Not only did they not condemn Hillary Clinton for her position on abortion, they should have said simply, a Catholic in good conscience cannot vote for such a person. They never did that.
You want to hear something even worse? I did an article on this. It was a follow-up to an exit poll, Bernard, where it actually said nearly 50% of professed Catholics voted for Clinton.
Yes, but if the bishops had shown leadership,
yeah,
that figure would have been much smaller. And it was worse than them simply not saying anything. Right. The very next day after that debate, there was the Al Smith dinner in New York City, and Cardinal Dolan was sitting right next to Mrs. Clinton and sharing a good time, laughing together at the various jokes that were being told at this dinner. What Malachi Martin would have said, and I agree with him wholeheartedly, don't tell me that today's bishops actually believe in the church's teaching in abortion, that abortion is actually the taking of a life. They may give lip service to that teaching, to that moral teaching for political purposes, but through their actions, the fact that they have not spoken out against pro-abortion candidates shows that they don't really believe in that doctrine. In other words, Malachi Martin would have said, watch what they do, not what they say. And from what you do, you have to conclude that this bench of bishops is, in this area at least, apostate.
Yeah, I agree with you totally.
Now, let's talk about Pope Francis. The Church's teaching on marriage is that it is for life. Pope Francis has introduced changes to the procedures for annulments to make it much, much easier. Basically, now, if there is a couple that want to dissolve their marriage, if they both agree, it's very easy for them to do so. Pope Francis has streamlined the procedures for annulments. Now, don't tell me, then, that Pope Francis actually believes in the traditional church teaching that marriage is for life, because through his actions, he has shown otherwise. He has shown that he believes that sometimes a marriage can be dissolved.
Yeah, it's just unbelievable times, folks. I mean, I sit back and I think to myself, meditate upon it. It's truly amazing that we are in those times, as far as I'm concerned, that the early apostles warned about. I think there's going to be some even more major steps being made as it relates to the papacy here soon. But yes, folks, across the board, we've got a new humanism in play, a whole new philosophy, which is a deviation from Thomism, new theology, new evangelization, new mass, new rites, new priesthood, new. Novus Ordo, that's what it stands for. So we can't hide behind this argument, if you will, that it's a deepening of our faith. That certainly doesn't fly. Is it tradition? Says St. John Chrysostom, ask no more. This is not tradition, folks. It's delusional if you think Vatican II equates to tradition. Now, what's the end game in all this? What did Father Martin say is the end game of Vatican II? What are they trying to do?
Well, Malachi Martin, for his last book, the title was something like how the Roman Catholic Church became a tool of the New World Order. Something like that was going to be his title. And how it became a creature of the New World Order. I think that's about what it was. So the end game is to have a purely humanistic church, one that is designed to build man's habitat on earth, one that is part and parcel of the New World Order. It is a church that is being completely de-Catholicized and de-supernaturalized. That is the end game, because the church has, through its history, a certain prestige. The architects of the New World Order want to harness that prestige for their purposes. Yeah. And the churchmen very often are willing to play along with this game because then they gain acceptance. But it is
that's
turning our Lord's message upside down. It is actually the destruction of the church, and it is apostasy.
Yeah, it's everything the early church fathers warned about, folks. They said eventually that the Vicar of Christ would flee Rome. Again, I kind of want to get into this topic. It's a more hot topic here in a second. I wanted to ask you this, though. Have you interviewed Dave Dionisi yet, Bernard? He's another traditional Catholic writer who seemed to have, I guess, some sort of talks with Father Martin. But he wrote a similar book on, I guess, some of these architects behind the scene that he has called out, and he was kind of sort of an insider. He might be someone to get onto your show, but he covers the message of Akita, La Salette. I'm going to get him back on the show next month. I just wanted to put that out there to you. Great person to interview.
Can I interject here?
What's that?
Can I interject here?
Sure, go ahead.
You just mentioned La Salette. Well, it's part of the La Salette message, which is church approved, that Rome would lose the faith and become the seat of the Antichrist. So if it says that Rome will lose the faith, that is apostasy. And I believe that's where we are today. Not necessarily by what they say, but by what they do.
Yeah, I agree with you in a general sense. I agree with you. I agree with Father Martin. I agree with Archbishop Lefebvre. I would be a little bit more specific, because the next step, as far as I have researched, is when Rome will lose the dogma of faith. I mean, they'll literally gut it out and formally say all religions are one. And then the Pope, who, again, I know you know this, Bernard, that we hold Benedict to be the true Pope. We believe that he is that Pope of Fatima, which is going to flee. And that was going to be my next topic, because that kind of ties in with the La Salette message that even Melanie had made mention of there being confusion at a certain point as to who the true Pope really was. Not sure if you caught this. I've tooted the horn for a while. I mean, I'm not saying this in an egotistical fashion, but I was one of the first to come out and just say Francis was an anti-pope, and I said it would pick up steam as more and more of the behind-the-scenes information started to come out. And again, so Father Kramer and I would hold that it wasn't a true resignation, that he just renounced a certain portion of the Petrine office. You have Archbishop Gonswine coming out and, saying, yeah, we do have two popes. You're seeing these other cardinals coming out and even saying, we've got two popes, one active, one contemplative. We know that's not a possibility. But what was interesting, Father Kramer had said this on his Facebook, and someone can correct me, if I'm wrong. And I think even Kathleen Keating had made mention of an anti-pope. What was Father Kramer's thesis? And they were basically using Father Martin, saying that, yeah, Father Martin had warned about an anti-pope to come after a pope, quote unquote, resigned. And what were you hearing behind the scenes? Is this?
Well, he believed that a martyrist pope was possible, and then we'd be in a very dire situation. Now, I think actually we are there, and I'll use a piece of evidence. Earlier this year, the Pope put out a monthly message in the form of a video, which anyone can access on YouTube, in which he was basically putting the Buddhist, Jewish, and Muslim religions on par with the Catholic Church. And there was kind of statements from all of them that they all believed in love, which sounds good, but what you've done is reduce religion to just a humanistic point of view, not a supernatural one. And without the supernatural, you don't have Catholicism at all. Now, the question you have to ask is, does Pope Francis actually believe that outside the church there is no salvation? If he will put out a monthly message like that, then to me it is very evident that he doesn't believe in this dogma, and you know that through what he does, not necessarily by what he says.
Yeah, I got a great talk with Father Kramer. We did about an hour and a half on this, where he runs down his information as it relates to him being a manifest heretic. I mean, he's had comments such as, there is no Catholic God. He believes in this kind of weird occultic God spray version of God. And Father Kramer will point this out visually for you. I've left all that information there so you could see it. Again, I think you can make the argument that he is a manifest heretic. I would just argue as a forerunner, if you will, that based upon Pope Francis being run out per canon law, that would still make him Pope, and then his actual quote-unquote resignation was invalid. So, and then recently, I don't know if you saw this too, Anne Barnhart, another pretty esteemed writer, I guess, within the traditional world, and Louis Verrecchio came out, and they've now say that Francis is an anti-pope. So pretty big, and I think more and more people will take that position. What about this?
But you see where it is going? Do you see where it is going? The fact that they're putting all these religions sort of together means that Pope Francis believes that the Catholic Church is one religion among many, all that are valid, really, in his mind. And so where this is going is they may not officially unify all these different religions. Today, that would still produce too much of an outcry, but it will be one big religious system where, unofficially anyway, it's one entity.
Yeah, I mean, I would definitely agree with you there. Pastorally speaking, we're laying in the groundwork for that. As it relates to these false religions, we have to know and understand, I mean, Jesus Christ is charity. We know that charity equals truth. Therefore, these false religions can't be charity if they don't have truth. So, I mean, even based upon that formula, if you will, it's not possible for these false religions to equate to love. Yeah, it's a very impotent, humanitarianist angle, if you will, on what love is. And then we could get into the whole, sodomite agenda. And I know Father Martin tooted the horn on this many years ago, too. I mean, he foresaw that coming, right?
He foresaw homosexual marriage long before it actually became a legal reality. And so that's why you can say that things are very much unfolding like Malachi Martin expected. And but the goal, the direction where it was headed is this: a purely humanistic church, one which is de-Catholicized. And if you look at the statements of Pope Francis, they're all kind of humanistic kind of statements. And from a humanistic point of view, maybe the church's teachings on various moral questions don't make sense. So that's why, unless there is a return to the sacred, any attempt at restoration in the church will fail. And that's why it's necessary to bring back the traditional Latin Mass, because that is a sacred liturgy, and the new Mass is primarily a humanistic liturgy.
Yeah, I also wanted to point this out. This is purely my point of view. I think they will formalize the one world religion, and it'll be right around World War III. They're using the threat of World War III, war on terrorism, as a backdrop to ultimately unite this one world religion. Every time you see some type of event along those lines, you always see Francis coming out and just denouncing violence in general or war in general, and in John Lennon fashion saying, hey, we just need to get along. So it's very nefarious, and people don't pay attention to that. But as far as I've read the New Age plans, the actual formalization of that one world religion will occur somewhere around World War III, a little bit before, a little bit after. I am uncertain, as to specific.
What the churchmen of various religions are going to do is use events to set up the new world religion. And I think there's a parallel, let's say, in history and politics. In 1913, in the United States, there was a financial crisis, and the politicians at that time used this financial crisis. They used events to set up the Federal Reserve Board. Well, we know what has happened to the value of our money since the Federal Reserve Board was set up. And the same thing, I think, is going to happen in world affairs. Right now, it seems like they're trying to set up a conflict with radical Islam. They're trying to set up a conflict in the Middle East, and they will use this sort of revulsion about the violence to kind of pull all these religions together to form this new one world religion.
Yeah, I completely agree. That's one of the things that when I go on radio shows too, I'm warning people about. That's basically the next big false flag, if you will, is the economic collapse. And I've had all the top economists and trendsetters, if you will, on, and they're all saying it's imminent now. Whether it's tomorrow, whether it's a year from now, we're not sure. And that's what's kind of interesting. I take a lot of heat for this, Bernard, so just lay it on us. I know we have YouTube videos of Father Martin saying the Antichrist is here right now. I take a lot of heat for this, but I wouldn't put myself out there if I did not perfectly align what tradition and the early church fathers say about the Antichrist and who is actually out there present, who perfectly aligns with this character, and his name is Maitreya. What can we say about that? I know at first, as far as I understand, he kind of rejected the notion, but I think he kind of came around to at least thinking it was a possibility, because I know he had a connection there with Kathleen Keating, and she agreed with me that Maitreya is the one. I mean, what can you say about that?
I think that an error that some theologians make is that they say the Antichrist is just a figure of speech. The actual teaching of the church fathers was that the Antichrist would be a real person. And the idea of this Antichrist person would be to produce a one world government alongside a one world religion. So what are they trying to do? They're erasing boundaries. Let's say in the European Union, they are also erasing boundaries between religions. Through that means they can create this new one world religion alongside a one world government, but it will be a system that, again, is totally humanistic, devoid of really anything of real religion. It'll be a phony religion. And we already have this to a certain extent in the Vatican II Church. Malachi Martin said that today you still have the appearance of the church. You still have the Pope. You still have cardinals. You still have priests. You still have ceremonies. But he said that really it's a facade, because the belief is gone. And so what you have in the Vatican II Church today is really an empty shell. And an empty shell eventually will collapse.
Yeah, and then we have Blessed Anne Emmerich to follow up on that point, she made a distinction, and I always have to bring this up to state of a contest, between Vatican II heterodox Church of Rome, which is heretical and schismatic, and the apostate church, which she called the apostate church of darkness. So, yeah, I mean, it's definitely interesting times. I wanted to add this. As far as my research, I mean, eventually they're going to kick out the sacraments in Rome. They're going to install this self-realization program under Maitreya when they get, once this formalized one world religion appears. His sidekick, the false prophet, in my opinion, his name's Master Jesus. It just gets very bizarre. And that's why I wanted to, I'm kind of leading into a point here, or a topic, was what did Father Malachi Martin have to say about the UFO and alien phenomena that was happening? I mean, he seemed to speak about it, not often necessarily, but it seemed he knew the connection.
Well, I think he spoke more about it on programs such as Coast to Coast than he did with me, where we had to focus. You see, Malachi Martin had such a wide range of knowledge that we could end up talking for hours and hours. So we had to produce a focus, and the focus that we kind of zeroed in on is the crisis in the church, because that is imperiling people's salvation. So there are some topics that he may have covered elsewhere that we did not get to, because our focus was the crisis in the church. What does a Catholic do to save his or her soul? And some of these outside events, like, they can be interesting to follow. It can be interesting to follow everything that's going on in the financial world. But our primary duty is to save our own souls. And our primary duty is to do what we can to save the souls of ourselves and our families.
Yeah, that's it. At the end of the day, it's about salvation of the souls. That's why we do what we do. I think when we bring all these topics in, Bernard, it helps to paint a more accurate picture of the time that we live in. You know, when I go on radio shows and I'm able to handle all these different areas, you know, I've got quite a few people who I've been on their shows who are now interested to some degree in becoming Catholic, because it's now they get more of the picture, if you will. And so,
right.
Yeah, so that's why I cover what I cover. Of course, you know, obviously to save our soul. But when you know about all of these different elements to the jigsaw puzzle, you start putting it together, you're like, oh, wow. Yeah, it's a lot worse than what I really had thought, you know, maybe a month or two ago.
I think that is true. And it is interesting to follow, let's say, what is going on in the financial world, because I do think that they're going to use a financial crisis eventually to overcome kind of the resistance that is building in Europe and the United States against the formation of a one world government.
Now, speaking about resistance, I'll say it in a more loose sense. What are you seeing from churchmen these days as it relates to, you know, an awakening, if you will? Oh my gosh, Vatican II isn't Catholic. Oh my gosh, they are trying to formalize a one world religion. I always kind of likened it to the frog being slowly boiled. I kind of liken Vatican II as the bridge over into the New Age. Are more and more people jumping out of the pot, so to speak?
Well, I think one has to be very careful when you use the word apostasy, because you should never use it in a way to say that the faith is completely gone outside of the institutional church. The fact that there is resistance, let's say, for example, the bishops of Poland are sticking to the traditional teaching that after divorce and remarriage you cannot receive Holy Communion. There is resistance to the changes that are being implemented. So I don't think you can say that the apostasy is, at least yet, complete. Now, as far as your question, are more people kind of hopping on the bandwagon? I would say yes. I see it happening actually more in the political realm than in the religious realm, because, like, for example, in the last number of elections in Europe, you see a lot of nationalistic parties are doing very well. I'm very disappointed, actually, that there aren't more Catholics speaking up. And after the meeting in Assisi, when Archbishop Lefebvre was alive, he said that he was like scandalized, not so much by the event, and he was scandalized by the event, but the lack of reaction. There should be many more churchmen that are speaking up against what Pope Francis is doing, which is essentially to throw out a 2,000 year tradition. If this had happened 100 years ago, the College of Cardinals would have sent him packing.
Yeah, such as the times. Now, did you happen to see the new film that's out, documentary on Father Malachi Martin called Hostage to the Devil? I personally have not. I did a blog on it. There's a website you can go to, malachimartindoc.com. It's a 90-minute documentary by Marty Stalker, and it's kind of a more general, it takes a more general angle on Malachi Martin. And this particular article suggests, was Malachi Martin an exorcist or an exhibitionist? So here again we see more generalities, more attacks, detraction. The writer of this particular article actually said it was a well-made documentary, but in the end it kind of still leaves open doors, so to speak. Are you aware of this particular documentary?
I'm aware of this documentary. I was in touch with the people that made it. They did focus on exorcism because they said that Malachi Martin's area of activity was so broad that in 90 minutes they cannot cover his whole life. So they chose to focus on exorcism. Now, I do want to make a general statement about the detractors of Malachi Martin. I have in my possession kind of an exchange of letters between Malachi Martin and his sister. At the time that he wrote the book, The Jesuits, his sister said, don't go ahead with the publication of this book, because from here on in your life, there will be attack upon attack upon attack on you. But Malachi Martin, he acknowledged this, but he said it was his duty to have this book published, and he did. But ever since then, he's had many detractors, and I think the source of it were Jesuits, because in the book, The Jesuits, he sort of showed that the modern Jesuits are an empty shell.
Interesting. Yeah, I just published, we were speaking off air, I just published a letter which came from a Novus Ordo website, but it was a long and lengthy letter from Father Malachi Martin to send out as a more general statement, if you will, to his detractors. And the basic, I'm not going to go through, all 7 paragraphs here, but the basic gist of it is I want to concentrate on my duties as being a priest, celebrating Mass, reciting a breviary, fulfilling his pastoral obligations. He even wrote a letter to his superior in Rome complaining about these, attacks, which you mentioned, more than likely from Jesuits. And basically his superior said, what were you expecting? I mean, can't you suffer too, for Christ's sake? And so that's what we have to do. And I know Bernard gets it. I get it. We're going to have to suffer. We have to keep putting truth out there. And that was one of the things that Father Martin did. He took a bold stand. I mean, he was a leader amongst traditionalists, if you will. And he really had to stick his neck out. And now we're kind of just following up, using a lot of his information. Now, here's a question.
In a personal conversation, can I intercede here for a minute?
Sure.
In a personal conversation I had with Malachi Martin, he basically said that if you're not being attacked, then you're not saying anything worthwhile. And so he just thought that that was part of the job that he had to do.
Yeah, that's the point well taken. And that's one of the things that when I get into prayer, I realize that when the dogs start barking, we know we've itched a nerve somewhere. And so, there's more and more attacks coming out of the Vatican, calling us all kinds of names, bigots, fundamentalists, not following their new mercy program. It's going to get worse and worse, folks. Now, as it relates to Father Martin and the Third Seeker, did he ever mention that it would be made public one day? And at what point, if so?
No. I don't think that ever came out from him that he expected it to be made public.
Okay.
But I do think it is very interesting that there was sort of this, what they called was the Third Secret of Fatima, that was released about a year after his death. In other words, Rome waited out Malachi Martin before releasing what I'm sure Father Kramer would believe to be incomplete or false. Because if they had put out a secret which was incomplete or false, then Malachi Martin would have been released from his obligation to keep the actual words and content of the Third Secret unavailable to the public. He would have been released from that, and then he would have put out the real Third Secret.
Yeah, interesting. I guess there's some who think maybe after it just becomes so, obvious at a certain point, kind of like the conservative cardinals waiting around for certain moves to be made by Francis. And we're already seeing that staging, right, Bernard, of the recent new cardinals. And then I just reported upon today, I think Cardinal Pell and Cardinal Burke are out. I don't remember the post they occupy, but they're basically out the door here too soon. And so we kind of see this staging of all these.
But basically, the problem is that there should be a lot more reaction than what there actually is.
Yeah.
That is the real problem. And so for the most part, those of us who want to save our souls, who want to keep to the Catholic faith, are on our own. And Malachi Martin continually emphasized the fact that we have to work for it, bud. We have to search for the truth. We have to make an effort to find the truth. Once we have the truth, we must make an effort to practice the faith. He also said, a time will come where it takes heroic virtue even to do a basic task like raising a family. And so that's where we're at. It's not going to be easy. It's going to be a hard struggle. And we are on our own, and we have to just keep up what we're doing, what you're doing, and what I'm doing, and what so many other traditional Catholics are doing, because I think this crisis is going to take perseverance to get through. We can't give up. And there's a tendency among many traditional Catholics to want to give up, to just simply make an agreement with Rome. But when you see where Rome is going, I don't think this isn't a time for an agreement with Rome.
Good, well said. Yeah, we're definitely on the same page there. I want to make a follow-up point as it relates to some of the people who are officially a part of the conciliar church, if you will. Again, as mentioned, we can only say things on the objective level. The Vatican II isn't a Catholic faith. We can't judge anyone's interior. I just wanted to make note, over this past year, Father Kramer has passed along a message to me privately that I have support, Father Kramer's support from certain cardinals in the church. I get emails pretty frequently from Novus Ordo priests who say, keep up the good work. I actually have one, Bernard, who's thinking about leaving a Novus Ordo parish out in New Mexico and joining Monsignor Perez out there in California. So, that's what we're trying to do here is, just trying to keep the faith. I wanted to also make mention that in Poland, there's a public proclamation of Christ the King by Novus Ordo bishops, which runs contrary, of course, to religious liberty. So that came out within the past 3 days or so. My next question for you, this is a personal question for me to you, Bernard, is this. I've been listening to Kathleen Keating a little bit lately, and I'm not sure if you're familiar with her work, but another, more popular traditional Catholic writer who just essentially fell off the face of the earth. And I remember when I posted some of her information a couple weeks ago, Father Kramer emailed me and said, did she just fall off the face of the earth, or is she even still with us? Meaning, was she knocked off, essentially? Now, I knew there was a connection there between Father Martin and Kathleen Keating. Were you aware of that connection? Because once she started talking about Maitreya, we can't find her anymore.
Well, I don't really know of a connection between the two. What I do know is that Malachi Martin kept up an absolutely incredible amount of correspondence and communications with people who were working to defend the faith, and also people that were struggling with various issues. He was a man who was in the last decade of his life in frail health, yet not only did he keep up a workload that would have tired a much younger man, but he also kept in touch with many of the other people who were coming to him for advice or for help in various ways.
Now, here's another hot topic here, Bernard. What did Father Martin have to say about this warning? And can you give us a more relative time period as to when this would occur, according to Father Malachi Martin's understanding? A lot of people are talking about this topic. I've covered it, over the past few weeks, but maybe you could break that down a little bit further, because, of course, you were so close to him.
Well, Malachi Martin would continually talk about when Our Lady comes. He said it sounded fantastic, but I think what he was referring to is that there is a prophecy, and some seers have talked about this, that there's going to be an event whereby everyone who is alive will be made aware of the state of their soul. And that will be an intervention of Our Lady. And so I think that's what he was referring to. It's sometimes there's a certain mystery to prophecy, so sometimes it's hard to spell out, because our Lord said you do not know the day or the hour. But I think that it can be certainly safely said that all the things we're talking about are in prophecy. And I think people have a tendency often to say a chastisement is coming, or this thing is going to be coming. I think for the most part now, we're not waiting for the prophecies. We're in the prophecies. Yeah. Because if churchmen are abandoning their faith, ultimately there could be nothing worse, because that means that millions of Catholics are going to lose their souls.
Wow, well said. Yeah, we are living the prophecies out. Unbelievable statement right there. Yeah, it's also, called a warning, illumination of conscience. One of the interesting things that Kathleen Keating said, because I've been through Maitreya's writing, is that he will actually steal that event, meaning afterwards he'll come out and say, no, I did that. I performed that, which is kind of eerie. Of course, we know, the devil doesn't want what's best for our souls, but it's kind of interesting that the New Age is saying that they will actually steal that, however you want to say it, event, the warning. Interesting. Wow, what a talk here. It's hard to believe we're well over an hour here. We'll kind of finish up here. Did Father Martin make mention of any accusations potentially that the Vatican II popes may indeed be Masons? I was actually just in contact with someone from the John Birch Society, and I can't recall his name. I ran out of time before we started talking here, and I was going to get him on, but he had basically said he had correspondence with Father Martin, gave him some information from some State of a Contest website, and he said that he confirmed that Father Martin said that was true, that essentially John the 23rd was a Mason. I was just curious if he had ever talked about that, maybe during the latter portion of his years, that they may potentially be Masons.
Well, I believe that Malachi Martin thought he had more time than what he actually had. I think God called him home a little sooner than what he had expected. And he was going to spell out a lot of the details of and name names about the various Catholic churchmen in his last book. Yeah. And unfortunately, this did not happen. Since Malachi Martin has passed away, in some ways we haven't had an intellect and a leader of his stature And I think Catholics, to a certain extent, get the leaders that they deserve, but say there wasn't a replacement to Padre Pio. So I think we have to pray and also reform our own lives. So once we do that, there's a greater possibility that we will have stronger leaders emerge and try to do something to save the Catholic Church, which is seemingly headed towards the wreckage of a new one world religion.
Yeah, agreed. Again, I appreciate Bernard coming on. Again, hard to believe we're 1 hour and 10 minutes in. You know, kind of in closing, from my perspective, what I do, the reason why I do what I do is ultimately, you know, obviously for Jesus, for the church. It's about repentance. It's about reformation of your life. We focus heavily on the interior life. I advise you all to read, you know, the Imitation of the Christ, the Imitation of Sacred Heart, Spiritual Combat, books like that. Getting your breviary on a daily basis, become very structured in that sense. But then also take an hour out and just get away to be with Jesus, whether it's a rosary walk. I, you know, highly preach silence and solitude. But in the end,
this is what I will say: that Malachi Martin believed that we are in a warfare. Yeah. We are in a warfare in a cosmic battle between good and evil, and we have to strengthen ourselves, and we have to do the kind of things that you were saying, to have the strong interior life, because this is warfare. We also have to deny ourselves maybe some of the pleasures of life that we may like to have. Why? To make ourselves strong, because this is going to be a rough period of history. We're not going to have the comforts that we used to have, and by that I mean we don't have the church as a support, the church hierarchy as a support. We are on our own, and that's going to take some internal strength, and that's why we have to take the time to read good books, listen to programs like yours, and have the strong prayer life so that we'll get through this, because many souls are going to be lost as a result of this crisis. That's why it's such a great tragedy. And when we really think of what's at stake, these churchmen who are good and who know what's really going on can't really take their personal comforts or their connections or whatever so seriously, because so much is at stake. They have to stand up, and if they suffer as a result of it, well, that's what our Lord did. That's what the first popes did. That's what the apostles did.
Yeah, very well said. We do have the Blessed Virgin Mary. Make sure you're wearing your scapular, praying the rosary. You know, she said at La Salette, you know, only faith would survive. Faith and hope. That's what we preach here at TradCatKnight. Spread your wings as an eagle in faith and hope. Keep your eyes wide in charity. You know, I pointed this out from the writings of Marie-Julie Jahenny, that our Lord was so irritated that no one was taking the truth seriously anymore, that he said during this period when the underground church is full-blown, so to speak, that, you know, people wouldn't be able to get to the sacraments at all. He said he was going to take them from them, just so people could have an appreciation for him, the sacraments, the church in general. And that's quite frightening. And I believe that's why Father Malachi Martin never came out, amongst other reasons. We know he couldn't. He was under oath. But he wouldn't come out and say it, because he's mentioned on air there would be a loss of faith. I mean, people would succumb to despair and doubt if they knew they were being led into a formalized one-world religion. Anything to add to that, Bernard?
Well, I think what you're talking about not only is going to happen, but it has happened. Let's see, in the Ukraine, the people lost their church, they lost their priests, and today I think this could very well happen on a larger scale. But I don't think our Lord is going to entirely abandon us. I think you'll always have what Malachi Martin referred to as the underground church. And above and beyond that, they can't really take away our faith. They can't take away our devotions.
Right.
And so we just have to stick to it.
Yeah, I agree with you. I should have been a little bit more specific there. I meant worldwide. Once worldwide communism is implemented, That's what I meant. But yeah, Ukraine's underground. China's underground. So yeah, it's kind of in the early stages of that.
And I believe we'll all be underground at some point.
Oh yeah, yeah, and then just a matter of getting to the sacraments. That's all I meant is, it's not going to be. We're going to be going to have sacraments every week or maybe even month. I mean, it might be once every 6 months or once every year. I mean, we have to realize once all their plans start to unveil, it's not like you're going to be out and about and be able to travel over an hour. I mean, they're going to be setting up checkpoints. I've covered this with other special guests. Once they release these epidemics in the air, I mean, you're not going to be able to move out and about like you are today. Because I know some traditional Catholics that will drive like a couple hours. Well, that's not going to happen. And even with the priests, it's not like they're going to be able to jump in a plane and go from Texas to New York or something. That's not going to happen. So that's why we got to keep praying for those in the Novus Ordo that they wake up, because obviously they outnumber us, and we still hold them as valid, you and I and Father Martin. So more and more of them waking up, then it will become easier to obtain those sacraments.
But they have to do more than just wake up. They have to be willing to put their reputations and even perhaps their lives on the line. And until we are willing to make sacrifices, there's not going to be much gain. Then it just becomes sort of an intellectual exercise of watching this tragedy happen. But we can't just watch it happen, because our lives are played for very high stakes, an eternity in heaven or hell. And that's why we must be willing to make the ultimate sacrifice if we have to.
Yeah, and certain cardinals have mentioned that. I think Burke's one of them. So, yeah, I have no doubt that a lot of the quote-unquote conservative cardinals know essentially what we're talking about. I think they're just waiting strategically for a certain moment, I guess. But I agree with you. I've been very critical of those in the Novus Ordo who don't come out and take a stand like us. For example, Bernard, there's some even professors from the school that I graduated from, Franciscan University, as you know, is highly charismatic, and you don't equate traditional Catholicism to where the school that I graduated from. Well, I know some of these professors, and they will agree with us silently, yet they won't say what we say publicly. And so that's what we're kind of talking about is, to take a stand for Jesus, it's going to require you sticking your neck out, and certainly that's something that Father Martin did.
And Malachi Martin was also extremely critical of what he called the good, middle-of-the-road conservative Catholics, that he said ultimately they're fat cats, they're not willing to make a sacrifice, they're not willing to stick their necks out. And as a result of that, many Catholics could lose their souls because, in the words of Edmund Burke, good men did nothing.
Yeah, that's it. And trust me, I've been very adamant and loud and public about that. Perhaps that's why so many semi-trads or pseudo-trads, however you want to label them, conservatives, don't like me personally, because I am that loud, and they kind of don't want us in their little clique and circle. But that's the truth of the matter. Wow, what a talk today with Bernard Janzen, Father Malachi Martin, Camouflaged Apostasy. Make sure you subscribe to TradCatKnight. Make sure you get to Bernard's website, triumphcommunications.net. Please support him. Please go through his articles, his videos. A lot of great testimonials there. Truly one of the pioneers within the traditionalist movement, I would argue, as well. Learned a lot from his talks with Father Malachi Martin and Bishop Williamson. I want to give you the last few minutes here, Bernard, to get us up to speed. If Father Martin were sitting here today, what would be the message, you think? If you were interviewing him, what would he say in more general terms?
Well, I think he would say pretty much the same things as what he said then, because the template that we're on has basically been fairly constant since Vatican II. I think all the information of his that we need to know is already there, let's say in that 8 set of books that we have published. Things have progressed further, but they've progressed sort of along the same lines. And that is towards the building of de-Catholicized, de-supernaturalized, one-world religion. One that simply serves man rather than God. I don't think he would say really anything different now than what he said then. The only difference is one of degree. It's not of kind. Things have gotten worse, but they haven't really changed that much in its direction.
Now, do you think there would be more of a sense of urgency? Not that he didn't have a sense of urgency there. I mean, on the individual level, I mean, none of us know when we're going to die. I mean, I could die tonight, whenever. Forget about the chastisements. Put that aside. We just don't know. But seeing the things that we're seeing with Francis, I mean, would he just be screaming at the top of his lungs like, "Hey, we're really close"?
I think he would say we're getting close. He often said before, we don't have long more to go. But I think he has always felt an urgency. I think I talked to one of the people in Father Gruner's organization. She believed that Father Gruner had worked himself to death because he believed the situation was urgent. I think it was urgent now. I mean, it was urgent then. I think now it's even more urgent. And I don't know if it's possible even to save the institutional church as we see it, because Malachi Martin said that the life of the church is going to mirror the life of Christ. And we know what happened. Christ died. So maybe the institutional church, as we know it, will die, and all of us will have to go underground for a while, but we can remain hopeful because our Lord did resurrect. And I think we know from the prophecies of Our Lady that a new and glorious church will at some point be resurrected. And that's the hope we continue to work for.
Yeah, and that's the reason why I brought that up, Bernard, was because he had made mention in at least several of his talks of when he was point blank asked about a date. He said it wasn't 50 years away. He said it wasn't 20 years away as it relates to the fruition of the Third Secret of Fatima and the New World Order establishment. That was implying the year 2017 because that particular interview was in 1998, I believe. So that's why many of us think, wow, there's such a significance behind the date of 2017. Do you think that's a possibility?
If we look at the statements of Pope Francis, if we look at his actions, I think you can safely say, we are living the prophecy. We are living the prophecy, especially that Rome would lose the faith. I don't think there's any doubt about that. And again, you go back to what Malachi Martin said, you judge leaders by what they do. And by what this Pope and the super force is doing, we can see that the apostasy is rapidly becoming a reality.
Now, without making, when I talk about Benedict XVI, sometimes people jump all over my case because they want to make it seem like I painted him out to be orthodox. But truly, he was in the know as it relates, in my opinion, to the Fatima message, wherein he said essentially the church was going to have to go underground and then essentially start all over again. And I'm paraphrasing from his memoirs book. But yes, that's why I would hold as a thesis that he is the true pope. He'll probably flee after the economic collapse, civil unrest transpires. He'll have some conservative cardinals following him. And then prophecy suggests that we'll probably be without a pope for 2 years as, Rome goes completely apostate with anti-Pope Francis, this false prophet character, Maitreya showing up. And then we're going to be in a situation like, oh, goodness, your everyday person is going to be like, where is the church? But then, of course, we know, as you mentioned, in the end, the Immaculate Heart will triumph. Wow, Bernard, absolutely wonderful stuff as usual. Got to get you back on in the future. Trying to get more and more traditional Catholics active on this channel. Why don't you leave us with the last minute or two here with just some shameless self-promotion, if you will. Talk about any of your works, articles, maybe the Wisdom of Ages box set, website, whatever you'd like to do, and I'll close it out.
Well, I'd really like to promote the purchase of the books, The Wisdom of the Ages, which is a box set of writings of Malachi Martin. The reason that we transcribe them into book format is because in the world we're heading into, we don't know what's going to happen. All the electronics that we have may at some point vanish. Technology has been lost in the past, let's say with the fall of the Roman Empire. We don't have some of the technology today that was used to build the great cathedrals. In the area of electronics, we've gone from 8-track to cassette tape to CDs to downloads. So I wanted to put Malachi Martin's work into writing so that it would be saved for all posterity. Because I think we titled it Wisdom of the Ages because a spiritual wisdom, unlike an earthly wisdom, does not date. We are still reading the works of St. Thomas Aquinas. And I think that Malachi Martin, if you look at the prophecy that he had, you look at the fruitfulness of his work, you look at his character, you have the profile of a saint. And I think more than anyone else, he made a complete analysis of the situation of the church since Vatican II. And so thus we are working very hard to preserve his words for all posterity.
Yeah, wonderfully said. I agree with you. You know, it just wasn't within the area of Catholicism, but geopolitically, you know, covering the New Age. He saw what was coming down the road, and that was just, you know, that was really opened up my eyes. Father Martin, you know, outside of Archbishop Lefebvre, Father Kramer, Father Hess, truly was an inspiration to me and got myself out of the Novus Ordo. But I would also encourage not only hard copies with Father Martin's work, but, you know, encyclicals on the councils. I've been trying to get all kinds of stuff in hard print because I do agree with you, in my opinion, as this Planet X system gets closer, I mean, it's going to be shutdown time and grid's going to be going down. Now, I don't know what's going to happen as it relates to the internet and things along that line, but I encourage you all to take the advice that Bernard has just laid down. Wow, folks. Great talk today with Bernard Janzen. If you have any special guest suggestions for TradCatKnight Radio, make sure you send them to me at Apostle of Mary. Questions, comments can be sent there as well. As I said throughout this talk, or at least at several points, you know, as eagles, we see the great storm coming. We are living the prophecies as Bernard has told us. We have a wonderful foundation, people to look upon. Father Malachi Martin is one of them. Let's not succumb to despair, worry, doubt, lose our faith. No, now is the time to spread our wings as an eagle and show ourselves to be true followers of Christ. And truly, when you give into doubt and despair, you displease Jesus. And so let's not do that. Let's show him faith. This is what makes him happy. We know without faith it is impossible to please God. And so let's pray for the 5 P's that I say. Pray for the Pope, pray for prelates, pray for priests, pray for poor souls in purgatory, and pray for poor sinners, especially those struggling with addictions and those who seemingly don't have anybody. Without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, please keep me in prayer. And until next time, stay safe and God bless.